It began with a single gunshot. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. A young assassin raises his pistol and the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne slumps dead in his carriage. In that instant, centuries of fragile balance shatter. Within weeks, Europe, the most advanced civilization on Earth, descends into a storm of steel. Across the continent, millions of men cheerfully march, believing war will be short, even glorious. Instead, they step into a nightmare. By winter, trenches scar the soil from the North Sea to the Alps. Men live knee-deep in mud, surrounded by rats and corpses. Machine guns mow down charging soldiers like wheat before a scythe. Artillery shells scream overhead, burying thousands alive. The sky itself becomes a weapon. Poison gas drifting silently into lungs, killing unseen. This is the Great War, the First World War. A conflict that will kill 20 million, redraw the map of continents and topple 4 empires. A war that promised honor, but delivered only horror. The world entered 1914 with kings and empires. It would leave 1918 with revolutions, ruins, and a silence haunted by the thunder of the trenches. The question is, how did it all unravel so quickly? Europe in the early 20th century stood at the height of its power. Its cities glittered with electric lights, its factories roared with steel, and its colonies stretched across the globe. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, were locked in a race for supremacy, each convinced their empire was destined to dominate the century. Beneath the pageantry of royal courts and glittering parades, however, the continent was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The balance of power rested on a system of alliances. Germany, young and ambitious, bound itself to Austria, Hungary, and Italy in the Triple Alliance. In response, France turned to Russia and Britain for the Triple Entente. To diplomats, this arrangement promised stability, a web of mutual defense that might prevent aggression. In reality, it meant any local quarrel could ignite a continental inferno. Militarism fueled the tension. Generals and politicians worshipped timetables and firepower. Germany expanded its army and built a fleet to challenge Britain's Royal Navy. France poured resources into fortifications along the Rhine. Russia, vast and insecure, mobilized millions of men in sprawling plans that could not easily be reversed. By 1914, Europe was armed to the teeth, like a room of men holding loaded pistols with hair triggers. Nationalism added fire to the mix. In the Balkans, Slavic peoples sought independence from the crumbling Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. Serbia, small but fiercely proud, dreamed of uniting South Slavs under its flag. To Vienna, this was a mortal threat. To Russia, the protector of Slavs, it was a cause worth war. Meanwhile, Germany's nationalism burned with resentment at being a latecomer to empire, and with pride in its rising industrial might. French nationalism simmered with revenge, never forgiving the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871. Colonial rivalries only deepened mistrust. Across Africa and Asia, European empires collided in their scramble for resources and prestige. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911 had brought France and Germany to the brink of war. Each crisis ended in uneasy compromise, but the scars lingered, proving how quickly pride could override caution. Yet in the summer of 1914, most Europeans still believed war was unlikely. International trade tied economies together. Royal families intermarried across borders. Britain's King George V, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Russia's Tsar Nicholas II were cousins. Intellectuals declared the world too civilized, too modern to fall into barbaric conflict. Europe, they claimed, had outgrown such slaughter. The reality was far darker. Beneath the optimism lay fear. Fear of encirclement in Berlin, fear of decline in Vienna, fear of revolution in St. Petersburg, fear of being left behind in Paris and London. These fears drove nations to gamble that war might be the solution, not the danger. In 1914, the stage was set. Empires stood armed and wary. Alliances promised protection but guaranteed entanglement. Nationalism burned hot, and militarism pressed every leader to strike first rather than hesitate. The assassination of an archduke would not create these tensions. It would merely light the fuse. And when that fuse was lit, Europe's leaders would discover too late that they had built a system designed not for peace, but for catastrophe. The question that loomed in those days was chilling. If war did come, would it be the short, decisive clash generals promised, or something far worse? The morning of June 28, 1914, dawned bright over Sarajevo. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags as a royal motorcade wound its way through the city. Inside an open car sat Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, beside his wife Sophie. They had come to inspect imperial troops in Bosnia, a province annexed just a few years earlier, a land simmering with nationalist discontent. Lurking in the crowd were 7 young men, members of a radical Serbian-backed group called the Black Hand. Each carried a pistol or bomb, prepared to die for their cause, South Slav independence from Austria-Hungary. As the motorcade approached, one assassin hurled a grenade. The Archduke spotted it and raised his arm in defense. The device bounced off the folded roof of the car and exploded beneath the next vehicle, injuring officers and civilians. Chaos erupted, yet Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing the day's program, even visiting the wounded at the hospital. Hours later, as his driver Ned down the wrong street by mistake, fate intervened. Standing on the sidewalk was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old student who had failed earlier in the morning. Now the Archduke's car had stalled right in front of him. Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Sophie, the other pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck. Within minutes, both were dead. The assassination shocked the world, but reactions were mixed. Some in Vienna saw it as a tragedy, but not a crisis. Assassinations of officials were not uncommon in the volatile Balkans. Yet within days, the event hardened into something far more dangerous. Proof, in the eyes of Austria's leaders, that Serbia had to be crushed. News spread rapidly through Europe's capitals. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II expressed outrage but assured Austria of Germany's full support. In St. Petersburg, Russia's ministers debated their duty to defend Serbia, the fellow Slavic nation under threat. In Paris and London, the assassination was seen as alarming but distant, a regional flare-up unlikely to spread. Yet Sarajevo was not just a local killing. It was the spark that touched the fuse of Europe's alliances, fears, and ambitions. The shots fired by a teenage radical would echo across continents, dragging millions into war. For the people of Sarajevo, the moment was immediate and bloody. Streets filled with soldiers and police, anti-Serb riots broke out as angry Austrians attacked shops and homes. But no one in the city could imagine the scale of destruction that would soon engulf not only the Balkans, but the world. Franz Ferdinand himself had been a complicated figure. Distrusted by many in Vienna, he was known for advocating internal reforms to give more autonomy to the empire's minorities. Ironically, the man killed for representing imperial oppression had privately considered loosening its grip. His DEA removed one of the few voices inside Austria-Hungary inclined toward compromise. As the Archduke's body was carried home, the empire mourned, yet its leaders also sharpened their resolve. Austria-Hungary, decaying and divided, saw in the murder not merely an insult, but an opportunity. With Germany's backing, Vienna prepared to confront Serbia with demands no sovereign nation could fully accept. The countdown had begun. Within 1 month, the world would stand on the brink of catastrophe. The question now was stark. Would Europe's rulers find a way to contain the crisis? or would they plunge blindly into a war beyond imagination? In Vienna, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand forced the empire's leaders into urgent debate. Austria-Hungary was a fragile mosaic of ethnicities, ruled by aging Emperor Franz Joseph and guided by hawkish ministers who feared the empire's decline. To them, Serbia was not merely a nuisance, but a growing cancer. Its nationalism threatened to unravel Austria's South Slavic provinces. The death of the heir provided a grim pretext for decisive action. Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold and Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf urged war. Both men believed only a crushing blow against Serbia could save the empire's prestige. Yet Austria-Hungary was weak, beset by internal division and military unpreparedness. Alone, it could not risk confrontation with Serbia, backed by mighty Russia. That is why Vienna turned to Berlin. In early July 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany pledged unconditional support, later called the Blank Check. Whatever Austria decided, Germany would stand behind it, even if Russia intervened. It was a reckless assurance, given without limit or caution, but rooted in Germany's fear of encirclement. The Kaiser and his generals believed that delay only strengthened their enemies. Better to act now, while Germany still held the advantage. With Berlin's backing secured, Austria crafted its ultimatum to Serbia, though. A document delivered on July 23rd stunned diplomats with its severity. It accused Serbia of complicity in the assassination and demanded humiliating concessions, suppression of nationalist groups, dismissal of anti-Austrian officials, and most provocatively, Austrian participation in Serbia's own internal investigation. To accept meant surrendering sovereignty, to reject risked war. Serbia's leaders agonized. They could not yield entirely, yet they knew refusal would invite destruction. Under Russian advice, Belgrade accepted nearly all demands, except those that violated its independence. In Vienna, this partial compliance was dismissed. Austria had already chosen its path. On July 28, 1914, Emperor Franz Joseph signed the declaration of war on Serbia. The crisis might still have been contained, but alliances pulled the powers into motion. Russia, determined not to abandon Serbia, ordered mobilization. Germany, bound to Austria, prepared to strike. France, allied with Russia, readied its armies. Britain hesitated, but its naval strength loomed over the Channel. Within days, Europe's leaders, most of them cousins by blood, were trapped in the machinery they had built. Historians later debated whether war was inevitable after Sarajevo. Some argued that cooler heads could have slowed the rush, that diplomacy might have brought peace. But the command decisions of July 1914 were driven by fear, pride, and calculation. Austria saw a chance to silence Serbia. Germany gambled on swift victory. Russia felt honor-bound to defend its kin. France yearned for revenge. Each acted not with caution, but with fatal confidence. In the end, the men who believed they controlled events had instead unleashed forces beyond control. The ultimatum to Serbia was more than a diplomatic note. It was the opening act of a catastrophe. The next question was inevitable. Once war was declared, how quick would the alliances drag all of Europe into the abyss? Austria's declaration of war on Serbia might have remained a Balkan conflict, but the alliance system turned it into something far greater. The first to react decisively was Russia. Bound by ties of culture, religion, and politics to Serbia, the Russian Empire saw itself as protector of the Slavs. To abandon Belgrade would mean humiliation on the world stage and the collapse of Russian influence in the Balkans. On July the 30th, Tsar Nicholas II approved general mobilization of Russia's vast army. This was not simply a gesture. Mobilization in 1914 meant calling millions of men from farms and factories, redirecting railways, and committing to war planning that once begun could not easily be undone. Germany interpreted it as an act of aggression. In Berlin, generals pressed Kaiser Wilhelm II to act before Russia's size overwhelmed them. France, bound to Russia by the dual alliance, watched anxiously. For decades, French leaders feared Germany's might, especially after the humiliation of 1871, when Alsace-Lorraine was lost. To France, Russia's mobilization was both a danger and an opportunity. Danger because Germany might crush Russia first and then turn west. Opportunity because united action could finally allow France to strike back. The French government therefore assured St. Petersburg of full support. Britain's role was less clear. The United Kingdom had long followed a policy of splendid isolation, reluctant to entangle itself in continental wars. Yet by 1914 it had joined the Triple Entente, more out of necessity than enthusiasm, wary of Germany's growing navy and ambitions. Still, when the July crisis erupted, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey hesitated. Britain's public opinion was divided, many seeing no reason to shed blood for Serbia. The tipping point was Germany's strategy. Facing enemies on two fronts, the German General S. Taft revived the Schlieffen Plan, a sweeping attack through neutral Belgium to defeat France quickly before turning against Russia. This plan virtually guaranteed Britain's involvement, for London had long pledged to protect Belgian neutrality under an 1839 treaty. Grey warned Parliament that a violation of Belgium would be intolerable, and the Royal Navy quietly prepared for war. Diplomats across Europe exchanged desperate telegrams. The famous correspondence between Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm, the Willy-Nicky telegrams, revealed personal appeals to avoid catastrophe. Both monarchs expressed friendship, even pleading for restraint, but their words were powerless against the momentum of mobilization. Generals and timetables dictated policy more than crowned heads. By early August, the dominoes fell. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France began full mobilization. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and the next day invaded Belgium. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding German withdrawal. When it was ignored, Britain declared war on August 4th. In less than 2 weeks, a Balkan assassination had escalated into a European inferno. The alliances that were supposed to guarantee peace had instead guaranteed escalation. None of the great powers expected the war to last long. Each believed its strategy would deliver swift victory, yet their confidence was misplaced. The question hanging over Europe now was not whether war would be fought, but how terrible it would become once the full weight of modern industry was turned to destruction. The outbreak of war in 1914 set vast economic and logistical machines into motion. Modern war would not be decided by bravery alone, but by industry, steel, and supply lines. Every great power had spent years preparing for this moment, stockpiling weapons and drawing up mobilization timetables that resembled enormous math. Ematical puzzles. Germany's war plan depended on speed. Railroads became the arteries of strategy. Thousands of trains were scheduled to carry soldiers, artillery, horses and supplies across the empire toward France and Belgium. Precision was everything. One delay could cascade through the system. German generals believed their efficiency gave them a decisive advantage. France, by contrast, poured resources into defensive preparations. Its economy had been heavily militarized since the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. French factories produced artillery in vast numbers, especially the famous 75 field gun. Mobilization meant not just summoning men, but aligning industries, food distribution, and national finances toward a single goal: survival. Russia's mobilization was slower, hindered by poor infrastructure and vast distances. Yet its potential was enormous, millions of men under arms, with immense reserves of raw materials. German planners feared that if Russia's economy and manpower were fully harnessed, the Central Powers would be crushed. Hence their obsession with quick victory. Austria-Hungary faced greater difficulties. Its industry was weaker, its finances strained, and its rail network fragmented by geography and politics. Mobilization orders collided with internal inefficiencies. Nevertheless, leaders pressed forward, convinced that national honor outweighed economic weakness. Britain, with its island geography, mobilized differently. The Royal Navy guaranteed secure shipping lanes, while the Empire's global economy funneled resources from Canada, India, and Australia. Britain's strength lay not in mass conscription at the start, but in wealth, credit, and industrial adaptability. Its armament industry would grow exponentially as the war dragged on. The economic shock was immediate. Governments suspended the gold standard to finance war, borrowed heavily, and redirected the entire industries. Civilian goods disappeared from factories, replaced by rifles, shells, and uniforms. Farmers and workers were drafted, leaving shortages at home even as armies demanded endless supplies. Mobilization timetables also dictated diplomacy. Once trains rolled, stopping them was nearly impossible. This rigidity trapped leaders in momentum. German generals told the Kaiser that once Russia mobilized, Germany had no choice but to act. French and Russian planners said the same. What had begun as political crisis became a logistical countdown. Behind the statistics were ordinary lives. Millions of men received summons, boarded trains, and vanished into the unknown. Families crowded railway stations, waving goodbye under banners proclaiming swift victory. Few realized they were witnessing the start of an economic and human mobilization unprecedented in history. The great question remained: could these colossal preparations deliver the short war promised by leaders, or would the machinery of supply only ensure a longer, bloodier struggle than anyone imagined? When Europe plunged into war during the summer of 1914, the reaction on city streets was astonishing. Instead of dread, crowds often erupted in celebration. In Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and London, cheering citizens filled squares, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. Newspapers printed headlines that framed the conflict as noble and necessary. Young men rushed to enlist, afraid the fighting would end before they had a chance to prove themselves. This spirit of enthusiasm was carefully cultivated. Governments unleashed propaganda campaigns portraying the war as defensive, just, and destined to be short. Posters in Germany declared soldiers would be home by Christmas. French leaders promised a glorious revanche against the hated enemy. Britain, at first uncertain, soon rallied behind Lord Kitchener's fay. Moe's recruitment posters urging citizens that your country needs you. Ordinary people responded with fervour. Schools held patriotic rallies. Churches blessed soldiers departing for the front. Intellectuals and artists, swept up in national pride, declared the war a chance for renewal. The young especially felt exhilarated, believing conflict would be a grand adventure. Volunteers marched through streets showered with flowers, unaware that they were heading toward mud, disease, and mechanized slaughter. Behind the public enthusiasm, however, unease lingered. Older generations remembered past wars and doubted the promises of swift victory. Some socialists and pacifists protested, warning that workers were being sacrificed for imperial rivalry. Yet their voices were drowned out by the thunder of nationalism. Once the first shots were fired, dissent was treated as betrayal. Morale was not only about soldiers, but also about families left behind. Propaganda encouraged women to send husbands and sons with pride, framing sacrifice as patriotic duty. Newspapers glorified letters from the front, portraying hardship as noble endurance. In this way, entire societies became mobilized, psychologically as well as materially. The illusions of 1914 would not last. By winter, soldiers and civilians alike would confront the grim truth. This was not a short war of glory, but a prolonged struggle of attrition. Yet, in those opening months, propaganda and morale bound millions together in shared conviction. The question remained haunting. How long could such enthusiasm survive once the grim reality of modern war revealed itself? The opening battles of 1914 quickly revealed a shocking truth. Technology had advanced far faster than strategy. Generals still dreamed of bold maneuvers and cavalry charges, but the battlefield had been transformed into a killing ground by new weapons and defences. Foremost among them was the machine gun. A single team could unleash hundreds of rounds per minute, cutting down waves of advancing infantry. In France and Belgium, German gunners scythed through attackers, leaving fields littered with bodies. The era of heroic frontal assault was over, though commanders were slow to recognize it. Barbed wire compounded the problem. Stretched across no man's land, it funneled soldiers into kill zones. Artillery was supposed to blast gaps, but bombardments often failed, leaving defenders untouched. Men found themselves tangled in steel, helpless under enemy fire. Artillery itself became the dominant force. Massive guns hurled shells miles behind enemy lines, shaking the earth and pulverizing trenches. Yet even these bombardments rarely achieved decisive breakthroughs. Instead, they turned landscapes into moonscapes of craters and churned mud. Cavalry, once the pride of armies, proved nearly useless. Horses panicked under shell fire and were shredded by machine guns. By the end of 1914, the romantic image of mounted chargers had vanished, replaced by static trench lines stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Defensive technology had decisively outpaced offensive tactics. Attempts to storm trenches resulted in staggering casualties. The French launched attacks in bright uniforms of blue and red, only to be annihilated by concentrated fire. German offensives suffered equally. Both sides discovered that courage could not overcome barbed wire and rapid firepower. Commanders struggled to adapt. Plans designed for swift victory collapsed into stalemate. Railroads and telegraphs allowed rapid reinforcement, preventing breakthroughs. Every advance was met by counterattack, every gain measured in yards at staggering cost. Soldiers experienced this transformation firsthand. Many had enlisted expecting movement and glory, only to find themselves living underground. Trenches became their world, muddy, rat-infested, endlessly shelled. The stalemate was not a pause but a grinding deadlock, fueled by weapons that favoured defence. The failure of offence in 1914 set the stage for years of attrition. Neither side could find a solution, yet both refused to concede. Political leaders demanded victories, while generals insisted the next assault would succeed. Thus, millions were sent again and again into firestorms they could not cross. The question grew more pressing with each failed attack. If technology made defense supreme, what strategy could possibly break the deadlock? When German armies surged into Belgium in August 1914, civilians found themselves on the front lines of modern war. Neutral Belgium had been guaranteed protection under international law, yet the Schlieffen Plan demanded its invasion. For the Belgian people, neutrality offered no shield. The city of Liège became the first major target. Its ring of forts resisted longer than expected, delaying the German timetable. But once heavy artillery arrived, including the monstrous Big Bertha guns, the defences crumbled. Townspeople endured days of bombardment, their homes shattered while soldiers fought street by street. As German troops advanced, reports of atrocities spread. Civilians accused of resisting were executed, houses burned, entire villages destroyed. The city of Louvain became infamous when its library, filled with medieval manuscripts, was deliberately set ablaze. International outrage followed, and the Rape of Belgium became a rallying cry for Allied propaganda. For ordinary families, survival meant flight. Refugees clogged roads, pushing carts laden with whatever belongings they could salvage. Mothers carried infants while children trailed behind, hungry and terrified. Many fled westward toward France or across the Channel to Britain, creating one of the first great refugee crises of the 20th century. In occupied towns, life turned bleak. German administrators imposed harsh rules, requisitioned food, and forced Seekoud, civilians into labor. Resistance was punished with shootings or deportation. Daily existence meant enduring shortages, curfews, and the constant fear of reprisal. Yet even under occupation, Belgian spirit endured, symbolizing defiance against overwhelming odds. The war did not spare other civilians. In France, towns along the front were shelled into rubble. Entire regions were emptied as people fled advancing armies. In Eastern Europe, Polish and Galician villages were trampled repeatedly by Russian and Austro-German offensives, leaving populations caught between rival empires. For Europe's cities, the war shattered the illusion that modernity had made them safe. Universities, cathedrals, libraries, and homes were reduced to ashes. The machine age that promised progress now delivered devastation. The plight of civilians also reshaped global opinion. In the United States, images of burned villages and refugee columns stirred sympathy for the Allies. Neutral nations condemned German brutality. Yet Germany insisted atrocities were exaggerated, blaming partisan resistance and the chaos of invasion. Truth and propaganda blurred, but the suffering of innocents was undeniable. As millions fled or endured occupation, one question haunted Europe. If even civilians were targets, what limits would this new kind of war observe? By autumn 1914, the great maneuvers envisioned by generals had collapsed into stalemate. The German advance through Belgium and northern France slowed, halted at the Battle of the Marne. There, French and British forces counterattacked, driving the invaders back just short of Paris. It was a dramatic moment, saving France from collapse, yet the victory did not bring decision. Instead, both sides dug in. The race to the sea followed. Each army attempted to outflank the other northward, maneuvering through Flanders until the line reached the North Sea by October. Ober, a continuous front stretched from the Channel coast all the way to Switzerland. What had begun as mobile war transformed into a vast static barrier. Maps of the Western Front revealed the new reality. An unbroken trench system, hundreds of miles long. Trenches zigzagged across farmland, forests and villages. Between them lay no man's land, a desolate strip churned by shells and strewn with wire. Each side fortified positions with sandbags, dugouts and artillery placements. The map ceased to change quickly. Battles shifted the line only by yards. For soldiers, the ground truth was harsh. Trenches flooded with rain, filled with mud, and bred disease. Rotting corpses lay unburied between lines. Daily existence meant enduring bombardments, sniper fire, and sudden raids. Maps recorded front lines, but they could not capture the misery of life lived underground. Commanders studied maps obsessively, searching for weak points, but railroads and telegraphs allowed defenders to reinforce any threatened sector. The geography of Western Europe, densely populated and crisscrossed by transport, favoured stalemate. Attempts to smash through with frontal assaults produced only staggering casualties. In this landscape, names like Ypres, Artois, and Champagne became etched into collective memory. Each offensive sought to alter the map, but left it largely unchanged. The cartographic lines remained stubborn, a grim testament to the futility of mass assaults against fortified positions. The war of movement had ended. The war of trenches had begun. Maps became symbols of frustration, showing generals bold arrows that never translated into reality on the ground. Soldiers joked that the front was like a frozen river, shifting slightly with the thaw but never truly breaking. The question that weighed on every staff meeting and every dugout was the same. How could any side possibly break this line that now stretched unbroken across the heart of Europe? Modern war did not only slaughter, it mutilated. The battlefields of 1914 to 1918 introde horrors medicine had never faced before. For soldiers, wounds came from new weapons that tore bodies apart in ways unimaginable a generation earlier. Artillery caused the majority of casualties. Shell fragments ripped through flesh, shattered bones, and left soldiers disfigured. Men buried alive by barrages emerged deaf or blind. The psychological terror of constant shell fire created a condition soon known as shell shock. Tremors, nightmares, paralysis, and emotional collapse. At first dismissed as cowardice, it gradually forced recognition of trauma as a medical reality. Then came poison gas. First unleashed by Germany at Ypres in 1915, clouds of chlorine drifted silently into trenches. Men coughed, clawed at their throats, and collapsed as their lungs filled with fluid. Later, phosgene and mustard gas inflicted even greater suffering, burning skin and eyes. Gas masks became standard, but fear of invisible death haunted every soldier. Medical services scrambled to cope. Field hospitals multiplied near the front, staffed by doctors and nurses who worked day and night. The sheer number of wounded demanded innovation, triage systems to sort patients, antiseptic practices to prevent infection, and new surgical techniques to save shattered limbs. Yet amputations remained common, and survival often meant life with permanent disability. Ambulances, many driven by volunteers, including future writers like Ernest Hemingway, rushed the injured from front lines. Trains carried thousands to hospitals deep behind the front. Organizations like the Red Cross expanded, symbolizing both compassion and the limits of humanitarian relief. Psychological care lagged behind. Shell-shocked men were sometimes court-martialed, branded as deserters, or subjected to crude treatments such as electric shocks. Still, awareness grew that modern war inflicted invisible wounds as devastating as physical ones. The term trauma itself entered wider use, reshaping medicine for future generations. Civilians also suffered. Bombardments of towns injured women and children, while epidemics spread in refugee camps. Food shortages weakened populations, leaving them vulnerable to disease. By 1918, the influenza pandemic would strike, killing millions more than the war itself. Medical progress emerged from tragedy. Techniques of reconstructive surgery advanced as doctors attempted to rebuild shattered faces. Blood transfusion methods improved. Nursing gained new respect as women like Edith Cavell and countless unnamed volunteers demonstrated extraordinary courage. The First World War became a grim laboratory of trauma and healing. Soldiers entered as men of flesh and spirit. Many left broken, scarred, or haunted. The haunting question lingered. If medicine could save so many lives, why did leaders continue sending millions into a slaughterhouse that no doctor could truly mend? The entry of the Ottoman Empire in late 1914 expanded the war from a European conflict into a global struggle. For centuries, the empire had been considered the sick man of Europe, weakened by decline and nationalist revolts. Yet strategically, its position astride the Middle East, the Dardanelles, and the routes to Asia made it enormously important. Both sides courted Istanbul, but Germany's diplomacy proved decisive. In August 1914, two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, evaded British pursuit and sailed into Constantinople. Gifted to the Ottomans, the ships became symbols of alliance. By November, the empire joined the Central Powers, declaring jihad against the Entente. Suddenly, the war stretched to new theatres, the Caucasus against Russia, Mesopotamia against Britain, and the Eastern Mediterranean against France. For the Allies, the Ottoman entry posed grave problems. Russia, isolated by geography, desperately needed supplies through the Dardanelles Straits, now closed by Otto. Man guns. Britain and France devised a bold plan to seize the straits, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and reopen the supply route to their ally. The plan became the Gallipoli Campaign. In early 1915, Allied warships bombarded Ottoman defences along the narrow straits. Mines and artillery, however, inflicted heavy losses. Naval assaults alone proved impossible. A land invasion was prepared, involving British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops. On April 24th, they landed on the rugged Gallipoli Peninsula. The landings were chaotic and bloody. Soldiers waded ashore under machine gun fire, clambering up cliffs and ridges. At Anzac Cove, Australians and New Zealanders fought desperately to establish a foothold. Elsewhere, British and French troops endured similar ordeals. What was intended as a swift breakthrough bogged down into trench warfare strikingly similar to the Western Front. Ottoman defence was fierce, led by commanders like Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. His leadership rallied defenders, turning back repeated assaults. The terrain favoured the Turks: narrow ridges, steep gullies, and limited room for manoeuvre. Allied troops, scorched by heat in summer and frozen in winter, endured appalling conditions. Disease, flies, and dysentery claimed as many lives as bullets. Months dragged on without progress. Repeated offensives failed against determined Ottoman resistance. Casualties mounted on both sides. By December, Allied leaders conceded defeat. The evacuation of Gallipoli was one of the few well-executed operations of the campaign, sparing further loss but leaving behind over 250,000 Allied casualties and similar Ottoman suffering. The consequences were profound. For the Ottomans, Gallipoli became a symbol of national pride and resistance, elevating Mustafa Kemal as a hero. For the Allies, it was a humiliating disaster that undermined confidence in leadership, particularly in Britain, where Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was forced to resign. Beyond Gallipoli, the Ottoman entry expanded the war into vast colonial regions. In Mesopotamia, British Indian forces advanced toward Baghdad, only to suffer defeat at Kut. In the Caucasus, Russian armies clashed with Ottoman troops in harsh winter campaigns. In Arabia, discontent simmered, setting the stage for later revolts encouraged by the British. Diplomacy also shifted globally. The Ottoman call for jihad failed to ignite widespread rebellion in colonial territories, but it alarmed Allied leaders. Meanwhile, neutral nations observed the widening war with concern. The involvement of the Middle East and its resources meant the conflict now touched almost every continent. The Allies had hoped to knock a central power out of the war. Instead, their failure at Gallipoli prolonged the struggle and cost countless lives. The strategic question remained unresolved. Could new alliances or new fronts ever break the deadlock strangling Europe? By 1916, the war had settled into a grim stalemate. Neither side could achieve the breakthrough their leaders promised. To break the deadlock, both launched colossal offensives, each intended to tip the balance of the war. Instead, they produced slaughter on an unprecedented scale: Verdun and the Somme. Verdun came first. In February 1916, Germany struck at the fortress city in northeastern France. Verdun was not merely a military target, but a symbol of French pride. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed France would bleed itself dry defending it. His aim was not swift victory, but attrition. To bleed France white. The assault opened with a storm of artillery. Millions of shells rained down, pulverizing forts, villages, and forests. French soldiers, many barely 20 years old, staggered through landscapes of fire and ruin. General Philippe Pétain, assigned to command the defense, organized a relentless rotation system, ensuring divisions spent limited time at the front before being relieved. This sacred way, supplied by endless convoys of trucks, kept Verdun alive. The battle dragged on month after month. German attacks seized ground but never delivered the knockout blow. French counterattacks clawed it back at enormous cost. Both sides endured hellish conditions: mud, constant shell fire, and poison gas. By December, casualties exceeded 700,000, with neither army achieving decisive advantage. Verdun became a symbol of French endurance. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Even as Verdun raged, the Allies prepared their own massive offensive on the Somme. Planned as a joint Franco-British operation, it became largely a British effort after Verdun consumed France. On July 1, 1916, the assault began with the heaviest bombardment yet seen. For a week, British guns hammered German lines, firing over 1 million shells. Commanders believed nothing could survive. At dawn, whistles blew and soldiers went over the top. But the bombardment had failed. German defences were deep and resilient. Machine gunners emerged as British troops advanced slowly across no man's land. The result was catastrophe. On the first day alone, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in their military history. Still, the offensive continued for months. New weapons appeared. The tank, lumbering across trenches for the first time, though too few to change the outcome. Artillery barrages grew larger, creeping forward to shield advancing troops. Yet progress was measured in yards, not miles. By November, the Somme had consumed over 1 million men from both sides, with no decisive result. Verdun and the Somme revealed the brutal logic of industrial war. Attrition, not maneuver, defined strategy. Leaders justified the losses by claiming to wear down the enemy. But soldiers in the trench, he saw only endless sacrifice for barren ground. The Western Front had become a grinder of men and nations. For France, Verdun was agony, yet also pride. For Britain, the Somme was tragedy, yet also transformation, marking its army's baptism of fire on a massive scale. For Germany, both battles drained strength without achieving victory. The world watched in horror. Neutral nations saw Europe bleeding itself into ruin. In the United States, reports of the carnage deepened debates about whether staying out was possible. In Russia, news of the slaughter fed discontent already simmering against the Tsar. By the end of 1916, millions were dead or maimed, yet the front lines barely moved. The promise of quick victory had long vanished. What remained was endurance. Which side could withstand greater suffering, greater loss, and greater despair? The question loomed larger than ever. If neither colossal battle could break the stalemate, what force, military, political, or global, would finally tip the tide of war? While massive battles consumed men by the hundreds of thousands, another quieter war unfolded in shadows, the struggle of intelligence and deception. Espionage, code-breaking, and secret plots shaped the course of World War I as much as artillery or infantry. Spies moved across borders disguised as merchants, students, or diplomats. Germany maintained networks in neutral nations like the Netherlands and Switzerland. The Allies cultivated agents in occupied territories, gathering information about troop movements and supply lines. Wireless radio, a relatively new technology, carried vast streams of military orders, but it also provided opportunities for interception. Signals intelligence became an essential weapon. The British established a secret code-breaking unit known as Room 40. Staffed by linguists, mathematicians, and former academics, it intercepted German communications and unravelled complex ciphers. Early successes included tracking the movements of German warships, contributing to the British victory at the Battle of Jutland. More importantly, Room 40's work exposed diplomatic schemes that would shift global opinion. One such scheme was the Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded message to his ambassador in Mexico. It proposed a daring alliance. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should join the Central Powers. In return, Germany promised support for Mexico to reclaim lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Room 40 intercepted the telegram. Breaking its code took time, but once decrypted, the message was passed to the British government. The dilemma was delicate: how to reveal the telegram without exposing Britain's intelligence methods. Cleverly, British officials arranged for the Americans to receive a version obtained in Mexico, disguising the true source. When the United States government released the telegram in March 1917, outrage followed. Many Americans had resisted involvement in Europe's war, but the idea of Germany encouraging an attack on US soil was intolerable. Even skeptics were convinced of German hostility. President Woodrow Wilson, already angered by unrestricted submarine warfare, now had the evidence he needed to rally Congress and the public toward war. Beyond the Zimmermann affair, intelligence influenced battlefields. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed trenches from above, mapping enemy defenses with unprecedented clarity. Decoding enemy radio traffic revealed troop concentrations and hinted at planned offensives. False information was planted through double agents and deceptive broadcasts. The war was as much about controlling information as controlling territory. Espionage carried personal risks. Captured spies faced execution. Famous cases included Mata Hari, the Dutch dancer accused of working as a German age. Though her true impact remains debated, her trial and execution in 1917 became symbols of the deadly stakes of espionage. For ordinary soldiers, the world of intelligence seemed distant, yet its effects were real. Battles could be won or lost depending on whether commanders knew reinforcements were coming or whether enemy plans were anticipated. Information, invisible but powerful, often meant the difference between survival and disaster. The intelligence war also revealed the global dimension of the conflict. Communications stretched across oceans via undersea cables. At the war's outset, Britain severed German cables, forcing messages onto wireless transmissions that could be intercepted. From Washington to Petrograd, information flowed in secret streams, binding nations together or tearing them apart. By 1917, deception and code-breaking had tilted the balance. The Zimmermann telegram helped bring the United States into the war, a development that would eventually overwhelm the exhausted Central Powers. The question now loomed over Europe and the world. With new powers entering and secrets revealed, would intelligence and diplomacy prove more decisive than the bloodletting of the trenches? By 1917, the enthusiasm of 1914 had long evaporated. What replaced it was exhaustion, disillusion, and in some cases, outright rebellion. Propaganda still flooded newspapers and posters, but its bright promises clashed with the grim experiences of millions who had endured years of slaughter. In France, morale cracked. After the disastrous offensives of 1917, particularly the Nivelle offensive, which promised a decisive breakthrough but delivered only mass casualties, French soldiers began refusing orders. Entire units mutinied, not in open revolt, but in collective refusal to attack. They would defend trenches but would not march into certain death. General Philippe Pétain, appointed commander, acted with a mix of firmness and understanding. Mutineers were punished, but reforms improved rest rotations, the food, and leave. France's army recovered, but the episode revealed how close morale had come to collapse. Germany faced its own strains. Food shortages bit deeply after the British blockade strangled imports. Bread was mixed with sawdust, families queued for hours for scraps. Strikes erupted in factories, and voices demanding peace grew louder. The government relied heavily on propaganda to maintain support, portraying the war as defense against encirclement. Yet, for many ordinary Germans, daily hunger undermined belief in victory. In Britain, propaganda remained powerful. Posters urged sacrifice, films dramatized German atrocities, and speeches framed the war as a struggle for civilization. But beneath the surface, war weariness spread. Conscription had been introduced, and losses in battles like the Somme were seared into public memory. Families across the nation lived with grief, questioning whether endless sacrifice had meaning. In Russia, morale collapsed most dramatically. Soldiers, poorly supplied and brutally commanded, deserted en masse. Revolutionary whispers spread through trenches. Why die for the Tsar while families starved at home? By early 1917, these sentiments erupted into the February Revolution, toppling the monarchy. The new provisional government tried to continue the war, but morale was broken. Bolshevik slogans of peace, land and bread resonated powerfully. By the end of the year, Russia would abandon the fight entirely. Propaganda continued to promise final victory, but soldiers and civilians saw through illusions. Letters from the front contradicted official optimism. Newspapers lost credibility. Satirical songs and underground pamphlets mocked the slogans of governments. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened dangerously. Still, governments recognized morale as a weapon. Censorship suppressed bad news. Photographs of smiling troops circulated, even when reality was despair. In occupied territories, propaganda sought to pacify populations, though resistance simmered beneath the surface. The war also reshaped cultural life. Writers, poets, and artists produced works that revealed disillusion. In Britain, poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen described mud, blood, and futility. Their words contrasted starkly with patriotic propaganda, capturing the emotional collapse of a generation. Mutinies and strikes revealed a deeper truth. Modern war was not only fought with bullets and shells, but with the endurance of entire societies. If morale broke, no number of guns could secure victory. Leaders understood this, which is why propaganda remained relentless even as faith dwindled. By 1917, whispers of revolution and peace spread everywhere. In France, in Russia, even in Germany, people asked, was this sacrifice worth it? Governments clung to slogans, but millions no longer believed. The haunting question grew sharper with every passing month. Could propaganda still hold nations together, or would despair and disillusion tear them apart from within? By 1917, the war had become not only a clash of armies, but a struggle of economies. Victory depended on which side could feed its people, arm its soldiers, and sustain industry under relentless pressure. The battlefield was measured in shells and supplies as much as trenches and rifles. Germany, hemmed in by the British naval blockade, faced growing desperation. The blockade prevented food, fertilizer, and raw materials from entering ports. Shortages spread, and civilian hunger deepened. Bread was rationed, meat nearly vanished, and substitute foods of poor quality appeared. Malnutrition weakened entire populations, making strikes and unrest more likely. Yet German leaders believed they had an answer: unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats prowled the seas, striking Allied shipping with devastating effect. Merchant vessels sank in alarming numbers, carrying grain, coal, and troops to Europe. The goal was to starve Britain into submission before American industry could tilt the balance. In early 1917, the campaign intensified. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping went to the ocean floor each month. Britain teetered on the edge of collapse, with food stocks dwindling to mere weeks of supply. The Allies responded with convoys, grouping merchant ships under naval protection. Slowly, losses declined, but the submarine menace remained deadly. Civilians across Britain endured rationing and long lines for bread, uncertain if the next cargo ship would arrive. German leaders gambled that hunger could break morale faster than guns on the front. While Europe strained, the United States transformed. Though still neutral until April 1917, American industry had already been supplying the Allies with weapons, food, and loans. Once war was declared, the nation mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Factories retooled to produce rifles, artillery, and munitions by the millions. Farmers expanded output, sending wheat and meat across the Atlantic. Railroads and ports roared with activity as a flood of supplies crossed the ocean. Financially, American credit became lifeblood. The US government lent billions to Britain and France, sustaining economies that otherwise would have collapsed under debt. The dollar, not just the pound or franc, became central to the Allied war effort. Germany, isolated and blockaded, could not match this torrent of resources. The contrast was stark. While German civilians endured the turnip winter of 1917, living on animal fodder, American soldiers soon arrived with abundant rations. While German factories starved for metal and coal, US production soared. The entry of American industry was less visible than soldiers on the battlefield, but its impact was immense. Economic warfare extended beyond food and weapons. Coal shortages crippled Central Europe. Inflation ravaged family savings. Black markets flourished. Women entered factories in greater numbers, replacing men at the front and sustaining war economies under strain. Entire societies were transformed by the demands of total war. By late 1917, it was increasingly clear that the Central Powers faced a grim equation. Even with victories on the battlefield, their economies could not outlast the combined industrial might of Britain, France, and now the United States. The war was becoming one of attrition measured not only in blood, but in bread. The decisive question loomed: would hunger and blockade break nations before new American strength could deliver the final blow on the battlefield? The year 1917 reshaped the war through two seismic diplomatic and political shifts: the entry of the United States and the collapse of Russia. These events transformed alliances, strategy, and the balance of hope and despair. In Washington, President Woodrow Wilson had resisted calls for war. Many Americans believed Europe's conflict was distant and unnecessary. But unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships like the Lusitania and countless others, killed American citizens and threatened trade. The revelation of the Zimmermann telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance inflamed outrage further. By April 1917, Wilson addressed Congress with a solemn declaration: the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States joined the Allies. At first, American military power existed more in promise than reality. The US Army was small, unprepared for modern industrial war, but American potential was vast. Millions could be drafted, armed, and transported. Factories surged into production. By the end of 1917, the first US troops, the American Expeditionary Force under General John P. Ushing, arrived in France. Their numbers were modest, but their presence signaled a flood yet to come. Morale among the Allies lifted, despair among the Central Powers deepened. Across the continent, Russia moved in the opposite direction. Years of defeats, shortages, and incompetent leadership shattered faith in the Tsarist regime. In March 1917, strikes and protests in Petrograd spiraled into revolution. Soldiers mutinied rather than fire on crowds. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending centuries of Romanov rule. The new provisional government pledged to continue the war, but it lacked authority. Soldiers deserted in droves, unwilling to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. Into this chaos stepped the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promising peace, land, and bread. Their message resonated with millions of weary Russians. In November 1917, they seized power. For the Allies, Russia's collapse was a disaster. One of the great pillars of the Entente had fallen. The Eastern Front, once a drain on German resources, began to dissolve. German troops could now redeploy westward, preparing for massive offensives in 1918. Diplomatically, the Bolsheviks negotiated directly with Germany, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, which pulled Russia out of the war entirely. The contrast between East and West was stark. While America entered with fresh strength, Russia exited in turmoil, leaving the Allies to face Germany with fewer partners but new hope across the Atlantic. Diplomatic realignment spread beyond Europe. Japan, an Allied power since 1914, expanded influence in Asia. Italy, having entered the war in 1915 on the Allied side, continued struggling along the Alpine front. Smaller nations such as Greece and Brazil also joined, adding symbolic weight to the coalition. The war was becoming truly global, with alliances stretching across oceans. For soldiers in the trenches, these diplomatic moves were distant yet meaningful. French troops saw American arrivals as proof they were not abandoned. German soldiers, learning of Russia's collapse, believed victory might still be possible if they struck hard before American numbers grew. Hope and fear shifted with each new alliance and each lost partner. By the end of 1917, the world's greatest democracies and empires were aligned against Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Yet the cost of continuing seemed unbearable. Diplomacy had brought new strength, but whether that strength could be applied in time remained the burning question. By early 1918, Germany faced a race against time. Russia had collapsed, freeing divisions from the Eastern Front, but American troops were arriving steadily in France. German commanders believed they had one final chance to win before the balance turned irreversibly. This gamble became the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. On March 21, 1918, the offensive began with a thunderous artillery barrage. More than 6,000 guns unleashed shells, gas and smoke across British lines along the Somme. Trenches disintegrated under the bombardment, and when the firing lifted, specially trained stormtroopers surged forward. These assault troops, lightly equipped and moving in small groups, bypassed strongpoints and sought to disrupt rear areas. The effect was immediate and shocking. British defences buckled, units were overrun, and towns fell in rapid succession. For the first time since 1914, the Western Front moved dramatically. Refugees fled as German troops advanced over ground long frozen by stalemate. Panic spread through Allied headquarters. Yet the success carried hidden flaws. The stormtroopers moved fast, but outran their supply lines. Artillery could not keep pace, and exhausted soldiers struggled to consolidate gains. The German casualties mounted quickly, especially among elite troops who could not be easily replaced. Instead of delivering a decisive blow, the offensive created bulges that consumed strength without breaking Allied cohesion. The attacks continued through spring. Operations codenamed Michael, Georgette and Blücher struck across the front, each designed to shatter Allied armies before Americans arrived in force. Once again, the Germans advanced, capturing territory unseen since the war's opening months. Paris lay within range of new artillery, shells falling on the city and sending civilians scrambling for shelter. But the Allies held. French reinforcements, rushed under General Philippe Pétain, stabilized the line. British forces, though battered, regrouped under Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Most importantly, the first significant contingents of American troops entered combat, their fresh energy bolstering weary allies. The German tide began to slow. For soldiers caught in the offensive, the experience was harrowing. German infantry advanced through mist and shattered villages, often fighting hand to hand. British and French defenders counterattacked desperately, clinging to defensive positions amid devastation. Civilians once more were swept into chaos, villages changing hands repeatedly, homes reduced to ruins. German morale initially soared with the advances, but exhaustion soon set in. Soldiers discovered that the captured ground contained little food or shelter. Supply wagons bogged down, and hunger gnawed at troops already weakened by years of blockade. The illusion of imminent victory faded as resistance stiffened. Allied morale, shaken at first, rebounded with American presence. The sight of fresh US divisions marching through French towns reassured civilians and soldiers alike that the tide would turn. The Kaiserschlacht had gained territory, but it had not achieved Germany's goal, a decisive victory before America's weight could be felt. By July, German strength was spent. Nearly 700,000 casualties had gutted the army. Stormtrooper units were depleted and reserves exhausted. The offensives had consumed Germany's last chance. The soldiers in the trenches sensed it. Letters spoke of fatigue, bitterness, and doubt. Many realized they had won ground but lost the war of endurance. The haunting question emerged across the front. If Germany's final gamble had failed, what strength remained to resist the counterblows now gathering from the Allies? The German offensives of spring 1918 shocked the Allies but also forced a decision long debated: the need for unified command. Until then, Britain, France, and later the United States had coordinated but not fully integrated their armies. Each pursued its own strategies, often clashing over priorities. Now, with German troops threatening Paris and British lines stretched to breaking, cooperation became a matter of survival. In March 1918, Allied leaders met at Doullens. There they agreed to appoint General Ferdinand Foch of France as Supreme Allied Commander. Foch's role was not to replace national generals but to coordinate strategy, ensuring resources were directed where needed most. His appointment symbolized unity at a moment of grave danger. Foch faced immense challenges. German offensives still raged and Allied armies were battered. Yet he understood the larger picture. Rather than react piecemeal, he sought to absorb the German blows, then launch coordinated counterattacks once enemy strength faltered. His guiding principle was simple: conserve forces until the decisive moment arrived. Meanwhile, American involvement grew rapidly. General John Pershing insisted that US forces fight as an independent army, not merely as reinforcements for British or French units. This caused tension, but Foch balanced demands, integrating Americans gradually while respecting Pershing's stance. By summer, hundreds of thousands of fresh US soldiers were available for battle. The turning point came with the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918. Germany launched yet another offensive, aiming to split French and British forces. This time, however, Foch anticipated the move. Reserves were positioned, counterattacks prepared. When German troops advanced, they met fierce resistance. Then, on July 18th, Allied forces, French, British, American, and even Italian, struck back in a coordinated assault. Tanks, artillery, and infantry moved together, driving the enemy backward. It was the first major Allied counteroffensive of the year, and its success stunned Germany. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Kaiserschlacht evaporated. Soldiers who had once believed victory near now saw retreat instead. Foch seized the initiative. He launched a series of coordinated offensives known as the 100 Days. Unlike earlier assaults, these were not isolated but continuous, hammering the Germans along multiple fronts. Each blow forced retreats, denying the enemy time to regroup. Rail networks, once a German strength, struggled under constant pressure. Command decisions extended beyond battlefields. Foch pressed for relentless pressure, arguing that only unceasing attacks would end the war. Political leaders, wary of further bloodshed, sometimes hesitated. Yet the tide had turned, and momentum favored action. The Americans, eager to prove themselves, supported aggressive offensives. For soldiers, the change was palpable. After years of defense and attrition, they finally advanced. Villages long lost were recaptured, civilians liberated, and morale lifted. Yet the cost remained brutal. Casualties mounted daily, reminding all that even victory demanded sacrifice. The unification of command under Foch did not erase national rivalries, but it ensured coordination at a critical juncture. Without it, the Allies might have fractured under German pressure. With it, they found strength to reverse the tide. By September 1918, the question was no longer whether the Allies could withstand Germany, it was how quickly they could force surrender. As 1918 dragged into its final months, the suffering of civilians across Europe reached unbearable levels. For 4 years, cities and villages had endured bombardment, occupation, shortages, and fear. Now, with blockades tightening and economies collapsing, hunger became universal. On top of this hardship came an invisible killer, influenza. Germany's population bore the heaviest strain. The British naval blockade had steadily choked imports of food and fertilizer. By 1917, Germans endured the infamous turnip winter, when the only available staple was animal fodder. Malnutrition weakened entire communities. Children grew thin, diseases spread rapidly, and mortality rates soared. In 1918, the crisis deepened. Bread lines stretched for hours, riots broke out in cities, and faith in the government eroded with each passing week. Austro-Hungary suffered equally. Its multi-ethnic empire, already fracturing, faced famine. Transport networks collapsed under military strain, preventing food from reaching starving regions. In Vienna, desperate citizens gathered in squares demanding bread. In Budapest, protests turned violent. Nationalities within the empire, long resentful, now saw collapse as inevitable. France and Belgium, devastated by occupation, faced ruined farmland and shattered towns. Millions of civilians lived under German control, forced into labor or stripped of resources. Families endured shortages of coal, bread, and clothing, yet morale in occupied regions remained defiant, even as repression intensified. Britain, shielded by its navy, escaped the worst starvation but still experienced rationing, rising prices, and grief from mounting casualties. Women queued outside shops, stretching meagre allowances. Families substituted miaulses with cheaper foods, while propaganda urged cheerful sacrifice for victory. Then, in spring 1918, influenza appeared. First noticed among soldiers in crowded camps, it spread rapidly through armies weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion. Returning troops carried it into towns and villages. Unlike typical influenza, this strain struck the young and healthy with terrifying speed. Victims developed fevers, coughed blood, and sometimes died within days. The pandemic became global, infecting hundreds of millions and killing at least 50 million people, far more than the war itself. In Europe, already ravaged by years of conflict, the toll was staggering. Hospitals overflowed, doctors and nurses collapsed from exhaustion, and coffins ran short. Cities imposed quarantines, but little could halt the invisible wave. For civilians, the combination of hunger and disease felt apocalyptic. In Berlin, families starved while influenza swept neighborhoods. In Paris, schools closed as children fell ill. In Spanish cities, newspapers reported openly, earning the illness the misnomer Spanish flu. Refugees, prisoners of war, and displaced families suffered the most, lacking shelter or medicine. Daily life became a struggle for survival. Coal shortages left homes freezing as winter approached. Food substitutes tasted bitter, and black markets thrived. Families sold heirlooms for bread or fuel. Mothers watered down milk to stretch supplies. Fathers returned from front lines to find children dead from illness. The strain eroded political stability. Strikes and protests multiplied, not only demanding food, but calling for peace. Civilians no longer believed promises of quick victory. Many felt betrayed by governments that seemed willing to sacrifice them endlessly. In occupied Belgium and northern France, despair mixed with hope as advancing Allied armies liberated towns. Civilians welcome soldiers with tears and flags, though they emerged from years of deprivation scarred physically and emotionally. The influenza pandemic underscored the fragility of societies at war. Even as generals plotted offensives, the invisible enemy in the air killed silently behind the lines. Soldiers in trenches fell ill by the thousands, their weakened bodies easy prey. Entire units became incapacitated, further straining collapsing morale. By late 1918, Europe was exhausted. Starvation and influenza revealed the war's total nature. Civilians were no longer spared, but had become central victims. The line between front and home had dissolved. The haunting question pressed on every family. Even if the war ended tomorrow, would their loved ones survive hunger and disease long enough to see peace? By August 1918, the German army, once triumphant, now stood on the defensive. The Kaiserschlacht offensives of spring had failed, bleeding manpower and morale. With American divisions arriving in force and Allied coordination under Foch improving, the stage was set for the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of blows that would drive the Germans back across France and Belgium until they sued for peace. The first strike came at Amiens on August 8th. Tanks, aircraft, artillery and infantry moved in concert, overwhelming German positions. Entire divisions surrendered, and German commander Erich Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. The front that had held for years began to unravel. From that point forward, maps of the Western Front finally shifted. Unlike earlier offensives, the Allies did not halt after initial success. Coordinated attacks continued along the line, giving the Germans no chance to recover. In September, the British advanced through the Hindenburg Line, long considered impregnable. French forces liberated towns along the Aisne and Oise. American troops fought fiercely at Saint-Mihiel and in the Meuse-Argonne, proving their growing strength. The German army retreated steadily. Lines that had seemed permanent dissolved. Soldiers fell back to improvised positions, but Allied pressure remained unrelenting. Civilians in occupied regions greeted liberators with joy, though their villages lay in ruins. Railways and supply depots captured by advancing forces revealed the logistical collapse of Germany's war effort. For soldiers, the retreat was demoralizing. Once told victory was near, they now trudged backward, hungry, exhausted, and doubtful. Letters home spoke of despair and futility. Desertion rates rose. Many surrendered willingly rather than fight hopeless battles. The ground truth on maps was mirrored by collapsing morale. The German High Command admitted privately the war was lost, though publicly they still proclaimed determination. Ludendorff urged an armistice before complete collapse. Political leaders in Berlin realized the military could no longer hold the line. The Allies advanced cautiously but relentlessly. Unlike in 1914, they avoided reckless overextension. Each success was consolidated before the next push began. This steady rhythm gave the Germans no chance to regroup. By October, Allied armies stood near the Belgian frontier and the Rhine. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, involving over 1 million American soldiers, demonstrated the full weight of US power. Though inexperienced troops suffered heavy losses, their sheer numbers overwhelmed German defences. Town after town fell and German retreat accelerated. On maps in war rooms, the great bulges created by Germany's offensives disappeared. The front line curved backward toward Germany itself. The once vaunted Hindenburg Line was breached, exposing the heart of the empire. The retreat was not orderly. Equipment was abandoned, units disintegrated, and command structures frayed. Mutinies erupted within the German navy, refusing suicidal orders to sail against the Somme British fleet. At home, civilians demanded peace as hunger and influenza ravaged cities. The 100 Days Offensive revealed the collapse not only of positions but of will. German soldiers still fought bravely, but they no longer believed victory possible. The Allies pressed forward, sensing the end was near. By early November, the map told the story clearly. The German army was in full retreat, its allies crumbling. Austria-Hungary sought peace, the Ottoman Empire capitulated, and Bulgaria had already surrendered. Germany stood isolated, its armies falling back toward the Rhine, its people rising in protest. The question now seemed unavoidable. With retreat accelerating and allies gone, how long could Germany endure before acknowledging total defeat? By November 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing one by one. Bulgaria surrendered in September. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice in October. Austria-Hungary, riven by nationalist uprisings, disintegrated into fragments. Only Germany remained, battered on the battlefield and crumbling at home. In Berlin, protests erupted. Workers struck, soldiers mutinied, and sailors in Kiel refused orders to launch a final attack. Revolution spread rapidly, fueled by hunger, exhaustion, and rage at endless sacrifice. By early November, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, fleeing into exile in the Netherlands. Germany declared itself a republic, hoping to secure peace before chaos consumed the nation. Meanwhile, Allied forces pressed forward relentlessly. The German army, though retreating, still occupied foreign territory. An armistice had to be negotiated. On November 8th, German representatives were escorted through the forest of Compiègne in France, brought to a railway carriage belonging to Marshal Ferdinand Foch. There, they faced harsh terms: immediate withdrawal from occupied lands, surrender of weapons, internment of the fleet, and continuation of the blockade until peace was formalized. The Germans protested the Everty, but they had little choice. Their armies were in retreat, allies gone, homeland aflame with revolution. After days of tense discussion, the armistice was signed at 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918. 6 hours later, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. Across the Western Front, men cautiously emerged from trenches. Some cheered, others wept, many simply sat in stunned silence. The war that had consumed the world for more than 4 years was over. Yet for countless families, celebration was tempered by grief. Millions would never return. The aftermath was staggering. More than 20 million dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire landscapes scarred beyond recognition. Villages wiped from maps, generations traumatized. The war had not only ended lives but shattered societies. Empires that had dominated Europe for centuries vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The Ottoman Empire crumbled, its Arab lands divided under British and French mandates. Russia, already in revolution, descended into civil war. The German Empire became the Weimar Republic, burdened by defeat and humiliation. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 sought to formalize peace. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war, disarm, and pay reparations. The treaty redrew borders across Europe and the Middle East, creating new nations but also sowing seeds of future conflict. Many Germans saw the terms as unjust, a diktat imposed without negotiation. For survivors, memory became a battleground. In France, Verdun symbolized sacrifice and resilience. In Britain, the Somme embodied tragedy and loss. In Germany, defeat bred bitterness and myths of betrayal. Monuments rose in towns and villages across Europe, engraved with endless lists of name. Armistice Day became a solemn ritual of remembrance, even as the scars of war remained unhealed. The war's legacy extended beyond politics. Advances in medicine, technology, and social change were born of necessity. Women who had entered factories and hospitals gained new roles and voices. Artists and writers captured the disillusionment of a generation, producing works that revealed the futility and horror of modern war. Yet peace felt fragile. The silence of November 11th was not triumph, but exhaustion. Europe had destroyed itself, and though the fighting ended, the questions remained unresolved. How could nations recover? How could societies heal? And could another catastrophe be prevented? The armistice at Compiègne ended the First World War, but it did not end the turmoil of the 20th century. Instead, it opened a new and uncertain chapter. The guns of November 11th, 1918 fell silent. But silence did not mean peace. Across the scarred landscapes of Europe, men crawled from trenches in disbelief, hearing only the wind where thunder had raged for 4 years. Some embraced, others stood hollow-eyed, unable to comprehend survival after so many comrades had fallen. Millions of families waited at home for soldiers who would never return. The war was over, but its consequences had only begun. World War I had been unlike any conflict in human history. It was industrial slaughter, the first great test of modern science, and mass society turned to destruction. 20 million lives ended, more than 20 million wounded. Vast swathes of farmland lay poisoned, forests reduced to skeletal stumps, villages obliterated. In northern France, entire communities were wiped from existence, remembered only as names on maps that no longer held houses or churches. For the survivors, memory was both burden and duty. France and Belgium built cemeteries stretching row upon row with white crosses and stone slabs. Britain's war dead lay scattered across continents, from Flanders Field, Dias to Mesopotamia. Germany mourned its fallen quietly, restricted by defeat. Families across Europe kept portraits of sons, brothers and fathers in black frames on mantels. Children grew up with absence as their inheritance. The war's legacy reshaped politics and geography. 4 empires collapsed: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian. In their place arose fragile republics and new nations. Poland reappeared after more than a century erased from maps. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born. The Baltic states claimed independence. Yet these new borders often carried unresolved tensions, lines drawn hastily in conference halls rather than rooted in shared identities. Seeds of future conflict lay hidden in the treaties that promised peace. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 embodied both hope and vengeance. President Woodrow Wilson championed a vision of self-determination and collective security through a League of Nations. But European leaders, scarred by loss, demanded retribution. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war, stripped of territory, and ordered to pay reparations. Germans saw humiliation and injustice, fueling resentment that extremists would later exploit. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution birthed the Soviet Union after years of civil war. Communist ideology spread fear across borders, challenging old orders and igniting political struggles that would dominate the century. In the Middle East, Ottoman collapse left territories divided under British and French mandates, sowing disputes that endure into modern times. The social fabric of nations also transformed. Women who had labored in factories, served as nurses and sustained families gained new recognition. In many countries, suffrage movements achieved victories after the war, though equality remained distant. Class hierarchies shifted as millions of ordinary soldiers returned with a sense of entitlement to dignity and rights. The myth of aristocratic authority was shattered in the trenches. Culturally, the war marked a break with old illusions. Writers, poets and artists gave voice to disillusionment. Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen described mud, gas and futility. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front captured the alienation of German veterans. Painters like Otto Dix depicted grotesque visions of battle, challenging the romanticism of earlier wars. Across Europe, a lost generation emerged, scarred, skeptical, seeking meaning in a world that seemed senseless. Technologically, the war accelerated change. Aviation leapt from fragile biplanes to powerful fighters and bombers. Tanks, though crude, proved decisive in breaking trenches. Chemical weapons introduced terror unseen before, while medicine advanced rapidly in trauma care and surgery. These innovations left a paradox: progress entwined with devastation. The human cost extended beyond the battlefield. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, spread by troop movements and weakened populations, killed tens of millions more. Entire families were erased, leaving survivors to wonder whether peace meant safety or only another chapter of loss. The League of Nations emerged from the desire to prevent future wars. It embodied a new idea that global conflict could be restrained by collective security. Yet without the participation of the United States and with limited power to enforce decisions, the League proved fragile. Its failures in the decades ahead would reveal the limits of idealism in a fractured world. Memory became a central struggle of the post-war years. Nations built monuments: the Cenotaph in London, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. Each sought to honor sacrifice, to give meaning to deaths that had seemed meaningless. Veterans gathered each November 11th in silence, poppies pinned to their lapels, recalling comrades lost. Yet remembrance carried different meanings: pride for some, bitterness for others, and for many, a lingering question: what had it all been for? The war's legacy stretched across continents. In Asia, Japan's participation boosted its global standing. In Africa and the Middle East, colonial subjects who had fought in Europe returned with new ideas of independence. The war had been global, and its consequences global too. The First World War was called the War to End All Wars. In truth, it was a prologue. The unresolved grievances of Versailles, the economic strains, the ideological divides, all ensured that peace would be temporary. Within 2 decades, the world would plunge again into conflict on an even greater scale. Yet World War I remains distinct, not only for its destruction, but for the transformation it wrought. It ended empires, redefined societies, and introduced modernity through fire and blood. It taught humanity that progress without wisdom could become catastrophe. The soldiers of 1914 had marched to war with songs and banners, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Those who survived returned years later to a world unrecognizable, scarred by absence and grief. Their sacrifice reshaped history, leaving lessons written in blood across the 20th century. The final legacy of World War I is not found only in treaties or borders, but in memory. Every village monument, every poppy in a field, every story passed down reminds us of the cost when ambition, pride, and fear drive nations to destroy themselves. The world awoke from its old order in 1918. What it found was not lasting peace, but the uneasy silence before another storm. The First World War began with the crack of a pistol in Sarajevo and ended with silence in a railway carriage in Compiègne. In 4 years, empires fell, borders shifted, and more than 20 million lives were extinguished. It was not merely a clash of armies, but of societies, economies, and ideas. Its legacy still shapes the modern world: the rise of revolution, the fragility of peace settlements, the haunting memory of lives lost in mud and fire. The men and women who endured it left behind lessons written in suffering, warnings of what happens when pride blinds leaders and when humanity turns progress into destruction. And so, more than a century later, the Great War remains not just history but echo, a reminder of the cost of forgetting. The world awoke from its old order, but what it found was not peace, only the uneasy silence before another storm.